Hey everyone, we're here today to talk about the uses of plywood. I guess you have to ask first, why do we even need plywood? And the reason is because your furniture, your door, or any piece of woodwork that you don't take wood movement into consideration for. So if you think about it, this board is essentially a bunch of straws laying down, and when it's humid, they suck up the moisture in the air, often in the summertime, and it makes the wood expand. In the wintertime, it expels the moisture from the end grain and it shrinks. If you don't account for that and you trap your wood either on top of an apron or in a panel, it will crack. And that's where plywood comes. Plywood is a different way of constructing, and the way that plywood is made is what makes it pretty much immune to wood movement. Basically, there's about 9 or 10 types of plywood. I'm only going to talk about 2, all right? Soft and hard. Soft plywood is made of things like cedar, pine. It's usually construction grade. You get it at Home Depot and Lowe's. You use it for sheathing. You use it on a roof. Essentially, there are voids in it, and it isn't dead flat. Hard plywood is typically made of birch. Now those plies are thicker and on a 90-degree angle from each other as they're laid down. And there are a couple different types of other plywood that are interesting that we won't go into too much. One of the newer products out there is MDO. It's a nice combination of MDF and plywood, so that essentially you have a layer of plywood in the center, you have MDF on the top and the bottom. It's dead flat. You get the benefits of plywood with screws using your pocket hole screws, so it holds fasteners better, but you also get the dead flat from MDF. So those are the types of plywood. What would we need it for? So my parents, their house was built in 1924, and they have these beautiful handmade doors. And inside, it's about a 4-panel door, solid wood in each panel. The woodworker who made those doors understood wood movement, and he didn't have plywood in the 20s. So around each panel, he left room for the wood to expand and contract. Probably sometime in the 70s, somebody decided to paint those doors. And the paint trapped the wood, so it wasn't able to move into the groove that the woodworker had made for it, and it cracked. All of the panels in their house are cracked because the paint trapped those panels. Wood movement is real. And it's interesting, even if you had glue lines, the wood will actually crack more likely along the wood grain than a glue joint in that scenario. So that's why a lot of modern doors, especially plywood, because it doesn't move much. Jigs is another great way to use plywood. Again, if you get good hardwood plywood, it's dead flat, and you can make jigs that are square. Jigs are simply a way to make woodworking tasks more simple. Down here we have a zero clearance insert. So essentially you just take that dead flat piece of plywood, you can do it on a table saw or on a bandsaw, and it ensures that you have a dead flat surface square to your blade, and chunks aren't falling down into the working surface of your saw. So that's a nice way to do a real quick zero clearance. You can purchase those in Phenolic that fit your table saw, but if you have an old table saw and it is difficult to find, you can still make them out of plywood. For something like that, you want it to be hardwood, dead flat, and well fitted into the insert. There's also, I think over here, a tapering jig, which is pretty cool. Again, something like this needs to be dead flat. If not, when you cut the workpiece, it will actually change the angle as it goes across. So again, plywood is just a great way to have perfectly flat, there's no wood movement involved, and it makes tapering really easy. This guy here is a spline cutting jig made of plywood. You can see that over time, this is one of the downsides of plywood, is that it does compress a little bit as you use it over and over and over again. Anybody who's made their own homemade crosscut sled realizes that it eventually moves out of square and you have to play with it. So here we've shimmed it up to make it square again after so many cuts. So it's better than, you know, regular wood, but it still is going to need maintenance and upkeep. The interesting thing on this jig is that these are hardwood slides. So these are actually going to be sloppy in the wintertime because they're going to shrink, just like this hardwood piece. So you're better off with a metal or plywood slide. Okay, we talked about cabinets, we talked about jigs. CNC is another application for plywood. It cuts into it really nicely, and as it cuts into the ply, it actually creates some really cool features in CNC signs. Some folks will put epoxy into that to make it look flat again. You can use all kinds of different colors. So CNC, I know for our CNC class, he will take just a piece of Baltic birch and do a quick project on it, and it looks really nice. It cuts easily. It's a hardwood, so it's not going to chip out as much as long as you're using the right bits. We also have a dead flat sanding jig here. Rick uses that in the humidor class. When he cuts his lid off the box, you're actually going 4 cuts around the table saw. Are you going to be able to get that perfectly flat to the other part? Maybe, maybe not. So a dead flat plywood sanding jig will ensure that the 2 pieces don't have gaps, that they're the same flatness. Sharpening, I know I was talking to Bert and he says if you get a dead flat piece of plywood, you can put sandpaper on it and you can use that instead of some of the more expensive stones that are out there. So whether it's diamond or water or oil, if you have dead flat surface and some sandpaper and a honing guide, you can actually do sharpening on hardwood plywood, on birch plywood. Okay. Other considerations. So plywood, sort of like when you're getting construction wood, it doesn't always have an exact thickness. Okay, this white side dado set is intended to cut grooves, 1/4, 1/2, and 3/4 plywood, but those are actually nominal sizes. When you take your caliper and put it on the plywood pieces, there are not a 1/4 inch, it's 7/32. It's not a 1/2 inch, it's 31/64, and it's not 3/4, it's 23/32. So when you are using either a table saw or a router table to cut grooves into plywood and you want them to fit perfectly, make sure you know how thick your plywood is. Don't assume that 3/4 is going to be exactly 3/4. So whether you just use a tape measure or fancy caliper to measure the thickness, you'll ensure that you have a tight fit in your dados with that. Blades. So a lot of table saw companies give you a 40-tooth. It's a nice generic multi-use blade. But when you start cutting plywood with that, you're going to find that it rips it up quite a bit. And if you go to a 24-tooth rip blade, which is intended to go through thick hardwoods, it'll really tear it up. So when you're using plywood, whether it's with a track saw or on a table saw, or even on a chop saw, you want to make sure you have something with enough teeth that's going to give you a really smooth cut. Freud sells some really nice plywood blades. The Craig track saw has a 48-tooth blade that will be really nice with plywood. So you want to make sure you're using the right blade when you cut it, otherwise you're going to have frayed ends and it won't look nice. Another use for plywood, of course, is veneering. Now, if you take that soft plywood that I talked about earlier that's construction grade, may or may not have voids in it. If it's not dead flat, when you put that veneer on it, every little flaw in the plywood is going to show. The glue that you use for veneering is not gap filling. So when you put that veneer on cruddy plywood, you're going to have a cruddy looking project. So if veneer is something that you're interested in doing, what is the surface that I'm putting the veneer on? Is it dead flat? And the only dead flat hardwood is either the MDO with plywood and MDF, or birch, Baltic birch plywood which is also made dead flat because it's made from hardwood. There's no voids in it. I can pass it around. So we have some. So when you're looking at your plywood from the edge, you want to make sure that there's no voids. Now this one has thin ply. Some of the really nice plywood, the Baltic birch that we get from some of the distributors, yeah, like this guy, is really nice thick ply. So it's just going to be a lot more stable and a lot flatter. And that's an important consideration when you're buying plywood. And you may wonder why it's more expensive. A lot more care was taken to manufacture it. So Bendy Ply, really good question. I have it on there. Normal plywood is at 90 degrees. Each ply is 90 degrees to each other. Bendy Ply, all of the ply actually all of the grain goes in the same direction. That's what makes it bendable. So they don't do it 90 degrees each ply. It's also poplar, which is a nice soft hardwood. So Bendy Ply is intended to wrap around. You don't even have to do kerf cutting, which is another way to do it. For regular thick plywood, there's kerf cutting. Pass that around. Where you cut into the, I did this like about 10 minutes ago, so don't judge me, all right? But I basically hacked away at it with my track saw here and a square, and I was like, hey, I can get it to bend a little bit. Now, there are actually kerf cutting calculators online. So if you want to know your radius, the thickness of your board, and the kerf of your blade, it'll tell you exactly how far apart to put these little kerf cuts. But that's how you bend your plywood, whether it's over an arch or you just want to make a cool feature, on a desk or something like that. So I did this in about 15 minutes. But I did it with a couple of these simple tools. The table saw is actually ideal because you're always going to keep the same height on the blade, and as long as you get a good distance, you'll get a much better cut. So Bendy Ply. Something similar to an MDO is what you get with Phenolic. So where you've got ply and then another non-wood surface on top of it. The difference is the MDO actually takes up about a third of the board, and then you'll have ply and then MDO. And then again, that's at plywood suppliers. So it's hard to get that here. But if that's something that you want us to bring in, it is the most ideal substrate for veneer. It's dead flat, and it won't show any of the voids or cracks that you can get in cheaper veneer or cheaper plywood. Any other questions?